Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, good to be with you, man. I know you've been traveling a bunch. How you been? How are things?
Good. Everything's been good. Yeah, it's so funny. We're like, and we've said this many times on the show. It's like, hey, after the new year or after the holiday season, like we'll have more time. And then it's now the holiday. And then we were just talking about, we're like, man, we don't have any time. Because now it's sales kickoffs for both of us.
It is the ultimate kiss of death between us. If we ever mention, hey, man, I think I've got some free time coming up. I'll be able to, no, that is the ultimate kiss of death. So, yeah. Well, listen, we're doing this show because we are coming up on 1,000 shows. And in fact, I think we've actually done more than 1,000 shows on Cloudcast, because if I look at our numbering, it says 996. If I look at our hosting provider, it tells us it's like 1,025. So I'm just going to call it like about 1,000 shows, which, I guess we should take that as a milestone. We've continued to do something for 15 plus years. It's, that's something. But
and I actually know where the lost episodes are, by the way. Yeah, so I don't know if you remember this, because this is a long time ago. Remember when we did the Linux Conf, and like we did all the shows back to back at the event, and it was like 10, 15 shows or something like that, and we just dumped them in the feed one day. And that's, by the way, like part of the show for today is lessons learned. One thing to learn is don't dump 10 shows into your feed all at once, because the listeners get really pissed. Yeah. So, and we didn't number them. We just put them because we were just like, oh gosh, we just got to get these. They might have just been
that was an interesting trip, because we went down. I think we went to New Orleans for it was like a Linux Con event, or it was like a Linux. What was it? Whatever was prior to the CNCF. So it was, the Linux, whatever. Yes. That was, I remember we met the guys who were Core OS, and I remember it was Alex and Brandon, and they were telling us about this new company that was going to build a new version of Linux. And we were like, what? And why would, and congrats to them. They went on and basically kind of didn't invent containers, but figured out containers and Kubernetes and all sorts of other good things. But yeah, it's always, that is one of those moments I think back on when you're like, why are you doing that? And they were far enough ahead that they were like, oh no, there's new thing coming. You don't even know about it yet, but it's going to be a big deal. So, anyway, a few weeks ago, I was listening to one of our favorite podcasts, the Acquired Podcast, and I guess they apparently have hit some sort of milestone. I forget which one it was. It was they've been doing it for some number of years, maybe it's 10 years or something like that. And they did sort of a look back on, lessons they've learned from let's call it their 10 years of doing shows. And so I thought, well, we've come up on 1,000. There probably are some lessons that we've learned, but also lessons that might be useful to the audience. So I made a list of 10. We might get through all of them. We might only get through a few of them. We might come up with some other stuff. But I thought this might be useful, not so much as just purely nostalgic, but sort of some stuff that as we're already talking about things like Cloud 2.0 or the next generation, some stuff maybe is useful to kind of at least capture for nostalgia reasons, for learning reasons, for whatever reasons. So first one I had on my list was lesson 1. Why did we create the Cloudcast? And I kind of frame this in the context of career expansion. So for anybody who doesn't know, why in the world did we start this thing?
Oh man, yeah. So it was funny because I actually remember this. We both had, I don't want to say dead end jobs, but boring jobs at the time in traditional infrastructure. And we're two guys in North Carolina. We're not in Silicon Valley. And I remember this. We were sitting at dinner. We sat next to each other at dinner. It was like, I think it was Maggiano's or something like that, like over at Streets at South Point. And we just kind of got to talking, and it was like, man, how do you stay on top of this stuff? And how do we do this stuff? And how do we kind of keep our careers going? And we were just like, hey, let's kind of do a podcast. Let's see what happens. And it was very off the cuff, like how all this was created.
Well, and I think he,
and it was a way to just keep learning.
I think you hit on it, because I was talking to somebody the other day who who was actually saying, I feel like I want to do a podcast. And, my thing to them was, not so much like, should you do a podcast? Should you not? I mean, obviously it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of people that do them, but it was sort of the idea of like, yeah, you should always be sort of working on some sort of thing outside of your job, but probably still in your industry that's going to give you some new skills, some useful skills. And I think, if nothing else, we learned a lot. We met a lot of people. We developed some new skills that I think we've probably used over the last 15 plus years, job wise and all. So to me, all that sort of stuff, like you said, yeah, we started this thing strictly because we didn't live in Silicon Valley and we felt really disconnected from stuff. And yeah, if I bring that full circle, I do feel like, other than, we're not going to call up like Elon Musk or Sam Altman or something, but I feel like we could probably call up most interesting people in the tech industry and be like, hey, can you give us an hour of your time? Because people are interested in it. And that's kind of a nice superpower to have at this point. So
absolutely. And I would say this too, to those out there that like may want to do something like this. I mean, once you kind of get everything going, I mean, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, like consistency being key, but to your exact point, like the conversations we have off recording is just as important as the conversations when we hit record.
Yeah, I mean the number of things that we've learned just because you start talking to people and they're like, oh, you've got an interest in it, is pretty amazing. Second thing I have on my list, and I get this question all the time. I don't know that I would have gotten it 15 years ago or 10 years ago, but people ask all the time. They go like, how did you learn, how are you able to learn all these topics that we cover? Because I think if we look at the Cloudcast, while the name cloud is in there, and we probably cover hundreds of niches of topics within here, whether it's, economics or technology or strategy or all these sort of things. And how have you been able to sort of learn stuff? Because I do feel like if we look back on it, we've been pretty good at figuring out how to at least be relevant enough to ask questions. I think there's a skill that goes along with that. But how have you been able to learn stuff?
Yeah, I'll put 2 points into that. So first of all, I think learning to learn is a skill in itself, right? Like when we first did this show, it was not too long after I had left working at a reseller, E+ Technology. And we used to joke of how many certifications I had in the industry. I think at some point I had like 15 certifications or something. And like you were coming off your CCIE back in the day. And like we just had this thing of like, we just always were kind of learning skills, right? And so once you kind of learn that framework and you have that interest and you keep moving things forward. So that's one piece of it. But then the second piece of it is comparing it to something you already know. There's very few net new concepts in this industry. There might be new technologies, it might have new names, but at the end of the day, it's abstracting something, it's encapsulating something, it's acting like this other thing or the way it's transported or this or that. I mean, a lot of it is just evolution of other technologies. And so how can you, compare it to something else and put it in your head and then easily explain it to others?
Yeah, I think you really hit on the two things. One is sort of, having sort of a perpetual curiosity, whether it's like, how did that work? Or just a willingness to sort of ask questions like, hey, being, starting from the perspective of going like, it's okay to not know stuff, but, having the ambition or the curiosity to go, I'm going to ask the question. And even if it's a, quote unquote, dumb question, I think is important. And then, I think at what you end up figuring out, and this is as important as learning the details of it, is there are so many things in our industry that once you learn a few basic patterns, whether it's like how a protocol works or how a system works or how a marketplace works or whatever it is, if you sort of can figure it out once, it becomes such a really good template for being like, okay, here's this new thing. Does it look like the thing that I'm working off of, right? So it's no different than like if you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu and you're like, okay, there's the Italian meal, it's got this and that, or here's a steak meal. And so in your mind, you've got 85, 90% of what it looks like, and then you're figuring out the other 10%. And if you can do that, then it's not as overwhelming to be like, oh, what's the new thing? So yeah. All right. Third thing I had on my list for you, and I'll give my opinion on this as well. But like, what do you think the biggest cloud trends that we've covered have been? We've covered obviously a lot of things. Obviously, a lot's changed over the last 15 years. But what do you think are the biggest trends that we've covered? Which one of those are still pretty relevant to where we're going?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to sum it all up. And I remember this one moment very distinctly. And it was kind of funny. Like some of the technologies and some of the technology waves we've talked about over the years, like you'll get onto it first, or I'll get onto it first, or we're like, oh, like, we kind of talk about things. And then there's lots of things that have come and gone. But I distinctly remember this one time you were like, hey, there's this thing. I think it's pronounced Kubernetes. And like, we're going to do a show about it. And I'm like, what the hell is that?
I do remember that.
And it was like, I'll never forget that. And you're just like, just jump on the podcast, dude. Like, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, cool. Like, that was the one of the biggest transitional moments, I think, for us. Like, yeah, I mean, sure, there was always the cloud and the rise of AWS and all the other hyperscalers and all the services and, all those other things. But I just, maybe it was just because of the name. I don't know. But I remember that one moment where I was like, what is this?
Yeah, that was, I think we might come back to that in sort of moments you remember. But yeah, that I do remember. I think for me, I think it was sort of two things. And they're more like byproducts of the cloud. I think one of them was just, what happens when, the sort of, you make technology immediate, right? And part of that, again, comes from like, we went back 15 years. Anything that we needed to do, like the cloud wasn't really a thing. SaaS really wasn't a big thing. It was like, you have to go acquire some amount of hardware. You have to install some amount of software. You have to figure out a whole million set of settings. You do all this stuff, and that just assumes like you could wait long enough to get some things. And then you could start to like begin to be like what you could do. And I think between the cloud making things sort of immediate and like, just kind of the barriers that broke down of like, I have an idea right now. I want to go try and do this thing. And then the other part of it was just, it was, again, when we started this thing, the proliferance of like stuff, yeah. The stuff that you could kind of do for free or at almost zero cost, whether it was like open source or a free tier on the cloud or, whatever that was, like between those two things to me, I think are as, I don't know, transformational as anything that we've seen over, and that obviously has ramifications for a lot of stuff. But like from like where we were, you getting those certifications or me sitting in a closet doing a CCIE and pulling cables and just, that piece, the immediacy piece of it always comes back to me as like, what happens when you have no friction? And I think that, that was big.
Yeah.
Yep. Fourth question or fourth lesson, I guess. We obviously went through a lot of transitions. Cloud was one of them, but we went through all the layers of the stack, whether it was IaaS or PaaS or SaaS. Mobile came along, like you said, Kubernetes and the whole open source community. Like as those things were going on, it's always weird to think about like, okay, this thing is happening right now, but then a couple years into it, you're like, oh, okay, that was a big transition versus, okay, that was just that really just turned out to be a feature or a bump, like, oh, it was service mesh or it was, WASMA, that was a bump. Like, how did you find yourself eventually thinking about technology transitions? Like, did you kind of have any sort of framework to go, okay, we're at the beginning of something or we're in the middle of something, or I should stop thinking about the technology and start thinking more about the economics, or like, did you ever figure out a way to kind of think about technology transitions?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing the way I kind of always thought about this was, I kind of realized pretty early on in the podcast that we started the podcast around a wave in the industry. But then there was going to be another wave, and then there was going to be another wave. And it was very much like I was just kind of in my head thought of everything in waves. And then there was going to be, is this a big wave or a little wave? And then also what I really, and this probably goes into what our next lesson is going to be, but for me, I really stepped back and thought about this of, okay, does it change the financials? And what I mean by that is like pre-cloud, like we were, hey, you go buy servers and you go install them in a colo or in a data center, and everything was very CapEx heavy. And, this transition to OpEx, and that kind of fundamentally changed a lot of things. And so I started to think about it of is this a technology transition, or is it something that fundamentally changes business structures and business models, whether it's, the way companies make money or the way companies expense. And that was always kind of my big framework of comparing things. Typically, the big ones were tied to some big financial
no, I
things.
think that makes a lot of sense. I think, we would have a lot of discussions, some of them on the show, a lot of them kind of off the show, because, again, you're when transitions are going on and you're kind of trying to figure it out, sometimes you start talking through some stuff and you're like, God, do I sound really stupid thinking about it this way? Or do I, am I kind of picking up on something? But I think we were constantly sort of asking ourselves, are we in the middle of something? Is this a big thing? And again, I think we were always trying to figure out, let's say it was a new technology. It was like, okay, is this a new technology that one company sort of has captured? Is there a community that's capturing this? Does it have competition against it? Is there 3 or 4 options for this? The old Kubernetes versus Mesosphere versus Docker Swarm kind of things. But I think I kind of agree with you. I think you kind of needed to look at 2 things. You had to be okay, how big and how competitive and how wide is the market? And then, like you said, what do the economics of this thing look like? Are they changing stuff? And I think, the way I think about this, especially in the context that you just talked about, put this into perspective. Even if you were just looking at it in the old days of buy hardware, buy software, go install stuff, blah, blah, there really weren't radical changes. I mean, there was radical changes of people moved off, a mainframe, which came from a single vendor and was horizontal. But I mean, for the most part, at the beginning of some of this stuff, it was VMware really changed stuff. They radically changed the economics, but nobody else was really radically changing the economics per se. And then cloud came along, and then it felt you were always having to push and pull a lever of technology economics, market competition. And so the dynamics, I think, got much more complicated over time. So following up on that, I guess, how important, so you probably more so than me came from a very technical background. You were very hands-on, you sort of trained in engineering. My background was more business, and I sort of learned the technology. How important was it for you as an engineer or in engineering roles to sort of learn the business side of things, business side of whether it's technology or cloud? How important was that for your career?
I can't stress enough how much important it was, because, and probably the podcast, I mean, we probably started it at around the right time without even me really realizing it, of if I wanted to advance in my career and, kind of keep advancing within an organization, you needed to have a business discussion. And you needed to be able to not just be technology for technology's sake, like we used to say sometimes. And so this whole concept of hey, that, being a really, really good technologist in most instances will only get you so far, unless you're a CTO or a founder and somebody who, quite frankly, the career isn't as much of a thing. At some point, you got to talk to somebody, and that somebody typically is going to have a business background, and you got to sell them on something, or you got to convince them of something. And the whole idea, and we've talked about it many times, I mean, it's almost like the unofficial motto for the show is follow the money, right? And the podcast really taught me to step back and think about, okay, hey, this is a cool technology, but is it saving time? Is it saving money? How is it impacting the business? And allowed me to have those discussions.
Well, and I think the other thing that I think we both learned over time was, if you don't, I mean, you kind of have to understand both to a certain extent, right? Obviously, you're looking at the technology. If you have enough of a background, or whether you're comparing it to other things in the past, you're kind of validating, okay, A, does this work? And then B, is it really any different, right? Is it significantly faster? Is it significantly cheaper? Is it significantly, broader scope? But then the other thing I think, and we sort of learned this from, hundreds of interviews with people, is if you don't have a framework in your mind of how do the economics of this stuff work, whether it's the current economics or the, what could happen because of the technology, it's really easy to get fooled by like some interesting demos or a really passionate, technology leader who's just like, this is going to change the world. You guys don't understand it yet, but you got to trust me. And at some points, you do have to sort of go, okay, I'm going to let this slide because the world changes. And when the world changes or when technology changes, sometimes you can't wrap your head around the whole thing. Like you didn't know how big the internet was going to get or how pervasive mobile would be or whatever. But yeah, I think we always kind of came back to sort of being like, that feels a little bit snake oily, or there's no way those, or not even so much they're lying, but like that math just doesn't work and it will never work. And I think we're seeing that right now with AI stuff, where as much as we're figuring out the technology, we always keep coming back to being like, wow, is this ever going to be profitable? Like, or what is this ever going to cost somebody or something like that? So yeah, I think you gotta figure out both those muscles. Your job may not require you to do both of them, but I think we can't recommend it highly enough. Like sort of learn a little bit of both as you're going along.
No, and I'll add this too. I think like we've had many discussions after podcasts, over the years, and it is kind of funny. I mean, we've stopped tracking it, but I mean, how many billions of dollars in, acquisitions and exits and all these other things. Like, I mean, we tracked it for a long time and it was, kind of a hero metric for us on the show. But I do take pride in the fact that we sought out good guests and we sought out, up and coming startups. And I think we got pretty good at picking the horses, if you will. And there would be some times where like, somebody would go in the show and then after the show, we're like, they're never going to make it.
Right.
But it was rare. Like it was.
Yeah.
Rare.
I mean, I think we would keep track of that. We would, we'd say, hey, there's so many, guests got acquired, or, what was the value of their acquisitions and so forth. And it was a little bit of a vanity metric for ourselves, but I think it was also a way for us to sort of go, are we doing a good job at picking quality guests or quality topics? Because at the end of the day, we didn't want to waste people's time who were listening to the show. And I mean, like, just a little bit behind the scenes, like we probably get 15 or 20 requests a day to have people come on the podcast. And so there is we didn't necessarily back in the day, but I mean, there is a certain amount of effort that we felt like we needed to go through and a little bit of diligence to be like, are these guys just another, monitoring company? Are they just another security company? Is there really anything useful here? And, we didn't obviously get them all right. And, we're like a venture capitalist, we got a percentage of them right. But yeah, I think we try, and we still do. We try very hard to not, I don't want to say that anybody's a bad guess, but we also, want to make sure that when we're looking at new technologies that, hopefully a year from now, if somebody's just picking up the podcast, they can be like, oh, that one's still relevant, or that company's still relevant, or that person, we're not finding a bunch of like, oh, they went under and they scammed a bunch of folks. So yeah. Next lesson. No,
real quick though, I did want to say this because you brought that up. I would love to see a study of how many monitoring and observability podcasts we've done as a percentage of 1,000.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the discussion came up a lot. Although, I mean, looking back at, Datadog, great partner, great sponsor, great partner, always did really well. Jeremy Burton's company, Observed, just got acquired. And so we still found some good ones, even though there was a lot of them. So next lesson. So kind of open-ended question. What structural changes do you think? So if we're fast forwarding 5 years from now or something, and you're talking to a classic IT organization, could be a bank or a healthcare company or automotive or whatever, like how would you forecast or project that the cloud will have impacted them, right? As opposed to just like, they allowed Snapchat to scale or something. But like, what do you think we're going to look back on, a few years from now and be like, this is what modern IT looks like because of the cloud or because of the changes that happen with the cloud, stuff like that?
Oh man, that's a really good one.
Yeah.
I'd say you go ahead and then I'll
I think
you go ahead.
To me, I think there's a couple of things to it. I think I think a lot of the things that were core to the cloud being successful. So whether it was like, I mean, if you think about the cloud, like you go back to even just like the AWS days and when, Hamilton would talk about what they did. I mean, a lot of those things we now see as really commonplace in modern IT. So it's like, we try and be consistent as possible everywhere. So the old thing of being like, we got to have 3 vendors for everything. It's like, that doesn't. It was like, ruthless consistency as much as you possibly can. automate as much as possible. And that's still, I would say most enterprises maybe are 20% automated, 25% automated. But I think, that is going to continue to expand because again, it's like I say, like every business project is a technology project sitting right behind it, right? So there's business opportunity, there's a technology project behind it. And those are only going to come faster. So the more you can be consistent, the more you can automate things, the more you can make things sort of self-service or even put it behind an API, I think is going to be important. So those fundamental things that you kind of expect out of AWS and were very different, 10 years ago, I think are going to be really commonplace. And then I think the other thing that we're going to see, it's starting to get there, but it's going to be better is like the sort of awareness and visibility of the financials of what's going on and the accountability for it. I mean, like, I think back to, one of our original guests was a guy named Matt Ellis from Cloudability. And, he was very much at the beginning of being like, I'm helping all these companies that are doing cool cloud stuff have some visibility into what's going on with their thing. And they were our go-to, like, hey, let's talk about finance person for years. Now that's starting to become kind of commonplace, whether it's, called FinOps or whatever it is. But I feel like that, those are going to be the legacy that'll build on whatever comes next.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was going to add one other one too, that it's almost like at this point, it's kind of almost become a bit of a running joke too, because I think cloud really had a good financial lesson and a good accountability lesson because I can say going back to data center operations days, I mean, we didn't necessarily know where everything was all the time. Like, even though it's somewhere in that data center, we didn't know how many there were. We didn't know what was going on. You didn't necessarily think about power, unless it was how much power to the rack. As long as the thing turned on, you didn't care about the electric bill. So you had this whole idea of IT just kind of, ran. It was very binary. It was very on or off. And this whole idea of, okay, well, how efficient is it running? That's certainly something to add. But then also too, there's upper limits to it all, because one thing cloud, kind of taught us, and AWS, preached for years, is like, hey, you can have anything pretty much run as much as you want across availability zones and this and that. And then a bunch of people you see with some of the AWS outages and some of the other things going on recently, a lot of people, either it was too expensive to do in multiple AZs or it was just too hard. And so people are like, the cloud's up most of the time. When it goes down, we're all going down.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. There was a certain amount of shared risk, whether or not you really signed up for it or not, that you kind of got with the cloud that you didn't necessarily have, kind of pre-cloud, but at the same time, you had offloaded a certain amount of risk of being like, hey, Bill's going to accidentally kick over the power cord that takes out, 7 racks in the data center because he's a klutz or something like that. So, I think that's another good one. All right, we are getting closer to the end. We're getting towards the bottom of the list here. So that is our first 6. Okay, so we got 4 left. What lesson from an episode do you think you think about the most frequently? And you sort of mentioned it, or at least you mentioned the Kubernetes one. Any other sort of lessons, episode where you're like, oh man, I think about that all the time?
So I know we've told this story, but I don't know that we've told it in a couple years now. One of the very first Cloudcasts we did, it had to be in the first 20, I'd say. I could go back and look it up. But it was the first podcast we ever did on PaaS.
Oh, I know what you're talking. I
don't know if you were. Yeah.
I think. Yeah. It was the PaaS company that Red Hat acquired that they never used the technology. Yeah.
Yes. And so this dude, and we talked to him, and it was the funniest thing, because this is what made me appreciate, okay, I probably need to do a little research, and I probably need to learn how to interview people, because that was probably one of the most awkward episodes ever, because maybe we weren't prepared, maybe, the guests, maybe he just wasn't expecting it, but it was just awkward pauses and awkward silences, and you could tell we didn't get it. And he wasn't explaining it in a way that we were going to get it. And so I learned a pretty early lesson. I was like, okay, I need to at least do enough research to be able to have a conversation with this person.
And the funny thing about that one, and I've got sort of a follow-up one on that was, I mean, he was so frustrated with us, and it was a very, very new technology. So I think it was really weird for us because it was very new, and quite honestly, like, I don't know that we've ever had a scenario like that. In fact, we've told guests before, like in the pre-talk, like, hey, this stuff's really new to us, so we apologize if we ask any dumb questions. And to me, it was really interesting to watch a guest who didn't view the podcast as an opportunity to sort of educate people. And he really was like, I kind of want to be coordinated for whatever I was doing. But it's a good lesson of like, especially if you're a startup founder or you're like, every opportunity you get to sort of speak about something in public, like whether you're selling or you're teaching or you're educating or you're evangelizing, like even if it's like to 10 people, like there's somebody at the other end sort of viewing you going like, that person made it really difficult for me. I had one of those moments. I interviewed Alexis Richardson, and there was another guy. And, for anybody who's listened to the show for a while, you've probably heard me say, and I know guests have heard me, I am absolutely the worst at pronouncing people's names, whether their name is Jack Smith or Tom Chen, or, you could be the simplest name in the world. And I think I kept calling Alexis Alexi, and the other guy's name I kind of got wrong too. And Alexis at one point went, "My name is Alexis." And he really got mad at me. And I was just like,
yeah.
I was just like, man,
he got mad.
Once I've seen it in my brain, it gets in my brain. I was just like, I'm so sorry. But the great part about it is, like, every time I see him in public, like he's great. And we joke about it, and he's a super good guy, and he's always been great about everything else. But like, yeah, don't, I guess, like you said, do your homework, but you absolutely will screw stuff up. You will. I guess the other lesson I take away from this, and, there's probably a million lessons that we talked about in some of the other stuff. We did a show, and I've mentioned this before. We randomly did a show with a guy who, probably wouldn't fall deeply into the technologist realm, because we've been lucky to have founders and CTOs and all sorts of PhDs and stuff. This was a guy who, and I forget what show it was. We'll try and find it. You can look it up. This guy was a coal miner, and he was in Kentucky. He was a coal miner in Kentucky,
yes.
And his mine basically got shut down, and he was sitting there, and unfortunately that part of the country, it became very impoverished because the main industry sort of went away, and so he sort of began teaching himself software just because he was looking for something else, and I think he kind of got wrapped up in the idea that there was a whole movement in the United States. It was like, well, you can be a coder, if you can be a coder and you can work your way out of things. And so he started teaching himself software, and unfortunately, one of the byproducts of these areas becoming impoverished is they were getting addicted to certain drugs, painkiller drugs and fentanyl and other stuff like that. And he had built this amazing application that got some funding from somewhere that would help you if you ever got yourself into a critical situation with some sort of drug overdose, or if you're a friend or something. And that one always kind of resonates with me, because I'm like, as much as we talk about all the things of technology and the Kubernetes or the MCPs or the service meshes of the world, like, at some point in time, like, it always comes back to being like, what the heck does that technology do? And when it does something that's that impactful, and somebody was just like, I just wanted to solve that one problem, and that thing is like literally life and death, like, that's the kind of stuff that resonates with you, and you're just kind of like, good for you, man. Good for you for doing, figuring that stuff out, for kind of literally dragging yourself up from your bootstraps and then making a huge impact on the world, even in your little part of the world. So that I remember that one a lot.
Agreed.
What surprised you the most? So we're on number 8. What surprised you the most about the Cloud One?
This is going to sound weird to say, but that it actually isn't even bigger than it was. I mean, I don't want to say it hasn't been big, but I mean, like, the running joke is, I mean, we're still in the first inning. How many years later, it's about to be the Cloud 2.0 era, but we're still in the first inning of the Cloud 1 era. I'm actually, it made me have an appreciation for status quo. And it had made me have an appreciation for going back to the business side and the finances side of all of this. Like, for all of the cloud that did happen, there's a lot of cloud that didn't happen. And And, like we again, kind of as technologists, you just kind of like line it all up and you go, hey, if I was starting a business, there's, I do this and I do this and I do this and you do this. But the whole idea of legacy technologies and tech debt and some of these other things, as big as cloud is and as big as the impact it is, I'm actually surprised.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great one. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to make this into a show or not, but I was sitting there thinking the other day, and I started doing some math and making some spreadsheets and trying to guesstimate. Like you said, the original sort of talk when cloud was coming out was like, this is going to replace everything. Like everything will be in the cloud. And, it was the original Andy Jassy, like, why would you never do this? It's always going to get cheaper. It's always going to get easier. Like everything should live here. And I got to thinking about it and I was like, okay, AWS has done X amount of revenue growth. GCP's done X amount, Azure's done X amount. Let's call that, I don't know, $250 billion worth of. And then I was like, where did that money come from? Like, did that money all come? Did it all sort of get taken away from the quote unquote old guard companies? Did it all come out of IBM and Oracle and HP and Cisco revenue? Or like how much of that was like net new, just technology spend? Because, we do always have, 3%, 5%, 8%. And so there's a part of me that wants to do, maybe it's a weekend perspective that's like kind of a look back on the last 10 years, 15 years of like, okay, we know how much money is being spent in the cloud. How much of that got taken from somewhere else, essentially is it moved and it didn't get replaced, and how much of that's sort of new, and trying to figure out some way to kind of have a guesstimate of what that looks like. So I felt like that might be an interesting metric to sort of carry forward as we go forward. But okay, yeah, I think for me the one that surprised me the most, and I guess to put it in context, was OpenStack, and I mean it in the context of, OpenStack kind of came along not because people were like, I want a new technology, but because people were like, I don't want, it was sort of stuck between I don't want VMware and I don't want AWS, right? Or, like it was a whole set of people that were like, I don't want that to be the thing that dictates where the future goes. And I think it was amazing to me to watch how many people got behind that, sort of more out of anger than like, like technology has a tendency to be like, I'm going to attract curious people trying to solve net new problems. This was all these people sort of trying to, build technology kind of out of anger, right? So there was a little bit of that. It was really interesting to sort of watch the community building, the community fighting, the creation of a foundation, the governance around that, just sort of watching all of that sort of come together. And as it was coming together, the number of people that kind of didn't realize how dysfunctional it was. And I don't mean, OpenStack is a terrible thing. I mean, it's gone on and it's, it was a running joke for kind of a while. It's gone on to sort of find its level and it has its place. But like the everything about that for about 4 or 5 years, whether it was like how it got created, how the foundation of it got created, how people, knew nothing about open source, were now learning about open source. But at some point, there just wasn't broader realization of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this is the quagmire we created. And, it didn't get figured out faster than it did. But I think a lot of things sort of learned from that, whether it was like Kubernetes learned from that and other things learned from that. And so that to me will always be sort of the epitome of, the contrast to AWS is sort of what happened with OpenStack.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll add this to it because you got me really thinking about that. It was amazing to me, as somebody who like, I worked, during those heydays, I worked for a storage company that was well integrated into OpenStack and had, some of the world's biggest deployments. But it was amazing to me because, I do tech demos and we talk to customers and all that, how many hoops you would jump through. And it always ended up being like, look, we're cloud-like. And look how much we're like AWS. And like it was like looking back, I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, we really were trying really hard. Like it was just kind of swimming upstream a lot of times. Those were interesting days. The craziest thing is like, I think if anybody ever goes to our YouTube channel,
video that has the group of videos that has the most downloads by like an order of magnitude, like 10x is all the ones about OpenStack. So it just sort of tells you a little bit about, even in our little podcast back in the day, 10, 12 years ago, like people just were like, oh my God, an alternative? Okay, let me dive into that thing. So, okay, two more. And I think we're going to bang through these pretty quickly. Lesson number 9, what did you expect to happen, which never really happened? What was the thing you were like, okay, this is coming next, and it just didn't really materialize.
So I'm not going to say that it never materialized, but it never, like in our thing of like big waves, little waves, I thought serverless was going to be a bigger wave.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there, and there's always serverless technology is foundations of things, and but I mean, there's no serverless conf anymore, and there's no big serverless startups anymore. I thought serverless, like in my mind, it solved a technology problem, it solved a business problem, like it checked all my boxes of like, okay, cool, like this is good, and it had its couple years. I mean,
we spun up an entire podcast on it. I mean, we went to their events, and I mean, it was the closest representation of like what cloud was supposed to be. Like you didn't have, like you just got it. You just got resources. You didn't have to manage them. You didn't have to spin them up. You only paid for what you used. It was super granular. Like you were like, God, this is the thing. And then, like everything else that looks like a silver bullet, you're like, and what are the trade-offs? And I think unfortunately the trade-offs, overwhelmed what was there. So it does make you sort of wonder, like, okay, that there was a serverless 1.0. Is there going to be a thing in a couple of years where people are like, hey, they'll call it something else, but we'll be like, oh, cool, they figured out the 5 deadly sins of the original serverless is now this new thing. That wouldn't surprise me if that sort of evolves over time. I think my thing that I expected to happen was, there was just that long period of time sort of between Kubernetes, kind of the rise of Kubernetes, the rise of the CNCF, and then all the stuff that sort of came after that. Nobody ever figured, I mean, we came up with a million new technologies from service mesh to WASM to, all kinds of things. I mean, there was always 10 new projects at KubeCon, and they never figured out a monetization model. I mean, VCs just kept funding and kept funding and kept funding. And you just kept watching all of them, and you're like, all of you have come up with all sorts of technologies, and none of you have figured out any variation of a monetization model. It's all just, it was just a whole period of time of being like, well, I hope Google buys me, or I hope somebody buys me. But there was, it was like nobody ever tried to figure out an alternative other than, well, we sort of made a SaaS service, which most of them weren't funded to do. So I'm sort of surprised, for as much interesting technology came out of that, that never kind of, nobody even tried anything really different, which sort of surprised me. They all went, well, there'll never be another Red Hat, or the Red Hat's not a real model, but yet nobody else figured anything else out, and Red Hat continues to make a bunch of money. And I don't say that like, as sort of a humble brag because I work for Red Hat, but like, like the one model that did work was there, everybody poo-pooed it, and nobody ever figured out anything different other than being like, well, how about proprietary? I'm just going to switch my license to be proprietary. And you're like, okay, well, okay.
Rug pull.
So, all right, last one, lesson number 10. We've made it this far. What were the most important lesson? What was the most important lesson you sort of personally learned over, the last 1,000 shows, the Cloud 1.0 era?
So this might come as a surprise to you because I don't necessarily talk about it as much on this show, but actually the importance of open source and the importance of the open source ecosystem, because prior to really jumping into cloud and kind of going through all the evolutions and technology waves, I really wasn't exposed to open source prior to this, like at all, full stop. I worked for, big vendors and sold big software and big hardware, and, not one company I worked for had ever had an open source product. And, as far as I was concerned, that was the crazy Linux people kind of thing, right? And I mean, for me, that's been far and away the biggest thing is, maybe the monetization models aside, the impact of it. I mean, it's just amazing.
We should do a whole show on that someday of like, hey, your job now involves open source. Like, what are you in for? We should put that on the whiteboard and come back and remember that one. Because I think we both could share some pretty interesting stories about being like, this is what you thought, this was the reality, or these are the questions you get from people who've never dealt with this stuff. Like this is their shock and awe and stuff. I think for me, I'll take two things away. One of them is just sort of a behavioral thing that I think we got from the podcast, which was like, at the end of the day, people have given us all sorts of feedback, good and bad, and all sorts of things. I think the two things that we have always talked about more than anything else is number one, be consistent, so that, if anybody's going to bother to give you their time, be consistent in respecting that. So like we've always, and you and I have had text messages at 1 a.m. being like, are you going to put the show out today? It's really important to get it out on Wednesday. Everybody, so I think consistency in what you do is really important. And then I think the other thing is quality is super important, and quality is really hard to do. And, for us, it started with just being like, make the audio quality better, and that took us a long time to figure out. And I think it's with guests and, people have a million options and they will gravitate towards quality. And I'm not trying to make a statement that like we're better quality than anybody else, but I think we've tried to really hard on those two things more than anything else. And we've probably gotten a million, takes and opinions and stuff wrong, but I do feel good about that. And I think that tried to carry that over into, my day-to-day job. And I think the last thing, and I think we've talked about this a million times, whether it's off screen or on screen or whatever, it is really, really hard for all the technology that comes along and all the, DevOps and this ops and that ops and all the combined words that mash together. Man, anytime you are trying to solve a people problem or an organization problem or a culture problem or a perceived problem with technology, man, you are in for the hardest thing you've ever dealt with in your life, right? And I think the DevOps community learned that. I think the platform engineering community is relearning that. It is just really, really hard to change culture, and we take it for granted, and we just we go, oh well, somebody spoke at an event and they did this differently. It's just going to work in my organization. That's probably the biggest personal lesson I took away was anytime somebody was in front of me and the expectation was like, the way this will succeed is you're going to change the culture of something, triple the cost, triple the length it's going to be, and triple the amount of like difficulty it's going to be, because it's just hard. People are hard to change. Institutions are hard to change. And I try and be much more aware of that, because I definitely wasn't aware of it earlier that's when we were doing this stuff.
Yeah. I think there's always been this, like, if you're a technologist, you can kind of go, well, the technology's better. Like, it just makes sense. Just do
take
that.
Less steps. Yeah.
And like, what's your problem? Like, what do you mean you have feelings about this?
Exactly.
Right. So,
well, good, man. I think the last 1,000 shows have been worthwhile. I hope they've been valuable in some way to people. And I'm not trying to, convey this as we're not going to do this anymore, but it did feel like a pretty good milestone to, stop and pause and think about it and maybe share some things with folks. So any last thoughts on 1,000 or whatever the heck the actual number is? I think we're definitely coming up to the end of it's been 15 plus years. We're on to our 16th year. So we'll just call it that. Any last thoughts before we wrap it up?
Yeah. No, it's been fun. I mean, this 1,000-ish shows. It's been definitely a fun journey, and for sure, it's been something that I've learned a lot. I've taken away a lot of lessons, and hopefully, some of the listeners out there have as well.
Well, cool. We are we've been hinting around at it. We have a show coming up here in, I don't know, one or two, where we're gonna kind of dive into some new stuff we're going to do. It's probably going to kick off in early February. So you folks won't have to do anything. You won't have to change anything, but there will be some stuff that'll be evolving, and we'll dive into sort of what our thinking is around that stuff here in a show or two. But we want to get towards the end of January, first part of February, and we'll kind of kick that off. So Aaron, thanks for the time, man. I will talk to you again soon. And folks, for everybody listening, thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community for 1,000, whether you've been around for one show or 999 of them. But thanks again. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.